Well, hello, class. This is Professor Shlomo Levy, continuing my series to teach by example, to take us out of the classroom and out of the textbook to the real historical locations. And today we are in beautiful Virginia at the home of our fourth president, James Madison. This estate is called Montpelier. It sits on almost 5,000 acres of land. This one estate, this one plantation. And it has been beautifully preserved and maintained. We just concluded a tour of the grounds and the home itself, and I want to share with you some things that you might find interesting as we study the Founding Fathers, as we're studying the Constitution. James Madison is considered the primary author of the Constitution of the United States, and he is the primary author of the Bill of Rights. When you think about his background and his training, it is not surprising that a man of his intellect and education would be able to accomplish those feats. One of the things we were impressed when we saw his room, and I have pictures of his room and his study there, was how it was lined from floor to ceiling with books. James Madison was a consummate intellectual. He was a Renaissance man. He was an Enlightenment thinker, meaning he studied the works of history, of the Greeks, of the Romans. He was such an intellectually and academically motivated person as a young man, although suffering from many physical ailments. He suffered from seizures, which many medical experts believe was a mild form of epilepsy that prevented him from military service and other occupations. But his mind was sharp, and he devoted himself to studying and trying to understand the human condition and history. Like our friend Benjamin Franklin, who we've studied, he studied many languages: Latin, Greek, even Hebrew. As a young man, he attended Princeton University, what will become Princeton University in New Jersey, completed a 4-year curriculum in just over 2 years, and then came back here to Virginia and began to get interested in politics. This led him, during the debates about the Constitution, to propose a new system of government, one that would create a stronger federal government that existed under the Articles of Confederation. This, he believed, would ensure the lasting survival of the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state was almost a separate country unto itself, passing its own laws, printing its own money. The federal government had very little power or authority, and he feared, particularly after Shays' Rebellion, that eventually this fragile confederacy, as it was called, the Articles of Confederation, would break up. And so they needed to create a stronger federal government. And that was the purpose of the Constitutional Convention that we're studying now in our course. Madison came to that meeting with a plan that he had already worked out in this home, what we call the Virginia Plan. So they didn't just say, well, what kind of government should we have? What kind of government should work? He spent hours and months thinking about it and planning it, looking at other systems of government, looking at democracies from antiquity, the Greek experiment with democracy, the Roman experiment with democracy, other forms of government, and came up with a plan that the United States should have these 3 branches of government that we have today: a legislative branch, a judicial branch, which we didn't have after the American Revolution, and a president, which the United States didn't have for almost 11 years from the beginning of the American Revolution until the election of George Washington. It was Madison, in fact, who helped persuade or convince or pressure George Washington. It was Madison who persuaded or pressured George Washington to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the spring of 1787. And it was then, and being able to get Washington to attend, that he had enough prestige. So when the country said, what is it that they came up with as an alternative form of government to the one we have now under the Articles of Confederation, Madison and others could say, this wasn't just like a few intellectuals and some students and some bright people theoretically coming up with a form of government, but George Washington was there, James Madison was there, Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, was there, Benjamin Franklin was there. So it was the best and brightest of American minds coming together to think about creating a better country. I think from some of my Philadelphia videos, I explained that they stayed there from May until September. So they worked on it all summer. When you see the Constitution, it isn't just, just some random ideas, but the discussions, the debates, the compromises that took place. One of the first things they did was took an oath of privacy that no one would share to the world what was said in that room during the deliberations. This allowed people to speak freely and without fear of contradiction or criticism. It allowed people to change their minds. So after they had voted on one ballot for a measure and then discussing it with their colleagues, the next time that issue could come up, that they might change their position. If it were exposed to the world, then once they made a decision, they would be hardened into that position. Also, living and staying together for a long period of time allowed the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the 55 people who signed the Constitution, to get to know each other, to understand and possibly respect each other more. This is something, a necessary element in politics, that politicians have to spend time with each other. They have to talk to each other. They have to listen to each other. And that's the kind of environment that was created there at the Constitutional Convention. The final thing I want to say about Madison, as great as he was, and there's a lot to be said for his contributions to the United States, but the thing that is most apparent when you're here the way we are is on this beautiful plantation of almost 5,000 acres, there were almost 300 enslaved people. You don't see them today. You just see these beautiful mountains and the hills. But this was a working plantation. It was those enslaved people who made Madison's wealth possible. That is, he never had a job, a conventional job, as we would understand it today. He inherited all of his wealth from his father through his marriages, and the working plantation of tobacco at this time in Virginia, of wheat. The masonry buildings that we saw gives us an insight in terms of not just serving the Madison family, but for the neighboring farms and communities, many of whom were too poor to own or afford slaves, would come to places like this, these plantations. And there you could buy tools that were made by enslaved brick masons and leather tanners, carpenters, and he kept a record of how much they produced for him. We see, as we toured the home, how close many of these enslaved people were in taking care of the personal needs of the family. For instance, when Madison goes to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, he brings his personal slave with him. Thomas Jefferson did the same thing, and George Washington. They didn't bring their wives, but they didn't travel without their personal enslaved people to take care of them. And they were very uncomfortable about the contradictions between liberty, freedom, and slavery. I'll talk more about that later when I take you to what was called the temple on this plantation, a place for him to think, and we'll talk about his legacy and some of his thought processes at that time. But again, as always, I encourage you to visit these historic places, to read more about the Founding Fathers and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And whenever you're in any historical location, come by and see what you can learn as a result of actually seeing the place. Take care, be well. Hope you're enjoying the course.